I think the worst case scenario is that essentially we enter some sort of totalitarian super state where, if you express an opinion that isn't in accordance with what they think you should think or express, then yeah, you will be subject to their restrictions.
Okay, so join me for a little thought experiment. Think about every system you move through today. Your bank account, your phone, your ability to post something, buy something, fly somewhere even. Most of the time it feels like air. Tap, pay, log, verify. It's frictionless, it's modern. But what if access became conditional? Not on whether you paid your bill, but on how you behave, what you say, what you donate, whom you donate to. What if one administrative listing in Brussels could freeze your finances, restrict your movement, sever you from any digital infrastructure, and not because a court convicted you, but because an unelected official decided you were problematic? And no, that's not a hypothetical. That's happening right now inside Europe. Which brings me to Dr. Alexandra Hofer. She's not a pundit or a culture warrior, she's an assistant professor of public international law who spent years studying sanctions. The real kind. The kind where governments freeze your assets and cut you off from the financial system. And she used a phrase that encapsulates the problem perfectly. She described the modern sanction regime as a civil death penalty, imposed without a judicial process to determine if the accusation is even true. Civil death without a trial. Now, whether you support sanctions or oppose them is almost beside the point. The deeper question is structural. What happens when executive power can root around judicial scrutiny? When the checks and balances aren't removed, just quietly bypassed. And here's the pattern, and you'll recognize it from every expansion of emergency power in history. Tools built for a crisis don't go away when the crisis fades. They normalize, they expand, they find new targets. So now you've got individual listed for the speech, media outlets restricted, harmonized criminal enforcement across EU member states. Each step seemingly reasonable in isolation, which is exactly how these things always work. Nobody designs an authoritarian system all at once. You build it one reasonable sounding policy at the time. But we go further. We talk about digital identity systems, central bank digital currencies, asset freezing as a governance tool, not just for Russian oligarchs. Then Alexandra takes us somewhere even more fascinating. International law as a belief system. She's finding legal scholars, people who build careers on the rules-based order, now saying, I don't believe in international law anymore. Now, how crazy is that? That's not a policy critic. That's the language of faith, a crisis of legitimacy. And when you combine it with visible double standards, Russia sanctioned, Israel not, Ukraine's sovereignty sacrosanct, Palestine's negotiable, you see why the cracks aren't just institutional, they're epistemic. So, this conversation today is about power, state, executive, corporate, financial, informational power, and the limits that are supposed to restrain it. If you care about due process, digital autonomy, whether democracies can drift into something else without ever formally declaring it, this will challenge you. Not with slogans, with legal reasoning. So stay with us for this one. Dr. Alexandra Hofer, what a pleasure having you. How are you?
Good, Thomas. Thank you for having me.
It's all my pleasure. Now, Alexandra, I have a little bit of information about you just to introduce you to our viewers. So, and please correct me if I'm wrong here. Yeah, assistant professor, public international law at the university in
Yeah,
Utrecht.
that's
But you live in Belgium, is that right?
I do live in Belgium. Yeah. So
Okay.
luckily they're close enough
You have
to
a,
each other.
yeah, I was wondering about that.
Yeah.
You have a PhD on legality and the effectiveness of unilateral sanctions at the Ghent University.
Yeah, that's right. So I did my PhD on, well, sanctions. So Not the type of sanctions that people have been commenting a lot, like the ones against Jacques, but normally country-related sanctions. So the ones that we hear a lot in general about Russia against the oil and gas sector, for example, or the financial sanctions. Yeah.
Hmm. It's good that you make this distinction.
Yeah, but they're not similar.
Yeah, yeah. Then published on judicial oversight of EU foreign policy sanctions, CSFP. We're gonna talk about CFSP a bit later. Then co-organized Den Haag workshop on military AI and rules of engagement. That's really something I would be interested in.
Yeah, I don't know where you saw that. I think it
Oh,
was a while ago that,
yeah.
sometimes in events, they kind of put your name um, as an organizer, but you're not that actively involved. So I might
Okay.
disappoint you there. Yeah.
Okay. Then we leave this out. Publishes the Cambridge Yearbook. What is this? Talk Nordic Journal of International Law.
It's a journal, yeah, in international
It's a
law.
journal, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're really one of the scholars who have worked at the exact intersection of sanctions law, state power, and individual rights.
Yeah.
Question or emphasis on individual rights? Yes or no?
I wouldn't put so much emphasis on individual rights, but a lot of interest in individual rights. A lot of it is about state power, and what the limits that international law applies or doesn't apply to the exercise of that power.
Okay. So if we talk about, I mean, we could jump right into it with your definition of state power and how the state power, or shall I say this, has shifted recently. And with recently, how do we define recently? Let's say with Trump's second term.
Yeah. So how the power has shifted since Trump's.
How state power in general has shifted since Trump 2 took over.
Yeah, that's a big question. Um, so I know, I mean, you don't mind if I ask you questions about what you're interested in and the work you do, because you do linguistics and cognitive warfare, if I understood correctly, right? A lot of that, or
Yes,
yeah,
so I wrote my thesis on linguistic deception markers in high-stakes business negotiations, and I then applied this knowledge. I mean, this is how this channel started actually with behavior analysis. So the first 20, 25 interviews are all with subject matter experts in regards to behavior analysis. Yeah.
yeah,
But when it comes to, and this is closely connected, of course, with cognitive warfare,
yeah,
NATO's cognitive warfare program, which targets the brains of its own citizens, right?
yeah,
So that this is interlinked.
yeah. Yeah, I find that interesting, but I think it's kind of the implicit part of security is how people think. Because you essentially have to convince somebody that something is a security issue, and then once you do that, you're able to implement all these additional measures that would allegedly ensure or guarantee their security. Yeah, and then, well, you asked about the definition of state power. Well, like, but the state power that I would usually focus on is the use of force. So, of course, their military capacities. If you talk about sanctions, it's very much the manner in which a state is able to interfere with the normal trade relations of another state, interrupt those trade relations, interrupt their financial transactions. Um, and so we see that, of course, the US has a central role there, notably thanks to the dollar. But then, of course, the type of work you do is the legislative power, which, of course, can spill into different areas. It's not only related to the international system, but like you said, like it can turn against its own citizens, of course.
If you talk about state power again, I'm kind of fishing in the dark here.
Yeah.
So can we take the EU for a brief moment of the discussion as a state? I know it's not a state; it's many
Yeah.
different member states. Yeah, but the EU has the EU Council, and the EU Council is run by unelected officials who have almost authoritarian powers, right? So, in your observation, what has shifted in this regard, and when was this kind of Or when did this actually start?
Yeah, so unfortunately, like I'm not an expert on EU institutional law, so I don't know when the council started to, let's say, broaden the scope of measures that it's able to adopt. So I don't know when it started. Because my real area, like what introduces me to the EU, is the sanctions it adopted, and then when it started to adopt its own economic security policies. Um, so yeah, so when the council started to adopt sanctions, I think at first it was just the copying, like implementing the traditional sanctions adopted by the UN Security Council, and then it progressively started to adopt its own, like have the EU adopt its own autonomous restrictive measures, is what they call them.
Mm.
And it,
Especially related to Ukraine, of course.
yeah, and it really, I think they really started to adopt, well, they even call it unprecedented sanctions in relation to Ukraine. So that really started to be a shift in the EU sanctioning policy. And they even started to sort of want to have a harmonized approach to how sanctions are implemented. So they criminalized, if within the EU you do not abide by the Council of the EU's own sanctions measures, you can face criminal charges. So they started to harmonize, the EU's approach to implementation and criminalization.
Mm. And if you say you mean another member state or you mean individuals within the member
Yes,
states?
no, so individuals within the member state, but of course the member states are the ones that implement these rules adopted by the council. So each member state has to make sure to have a harmonized approach when they apply the laws towards their own citizens or people within their jurisdiction.
Before we continue, a quick reality check. If you're watching this here, there's a decent chance you were not meant to. My reach on YouTube has virtually collapsed. Not gradually, but mechanically. From six-figure views to a couple of thousand on a good day. The same pattern that ended my Twitter X account is now visible here. Throttled first, suspended later. And no, it's not paranoia, it's platform behavior. I have hundreds, virtually hundreds of viewer comments confirming it too. That's why the safest place to follow my work is on Substack. No algorithmic muting, no silent erasure. Direct signal, direct audience. If you want continuity, not just these clips, join me there. Now back to the interview. Yeah, and I think then we are already by European Council Resolution CSFP 2025 966, right?
Yeah, for example, yeah.
So that's a resolution, and correct me if I'm wrong, that has been implemented, I believe, in 2024. Is closely aligned, so initially closely aligned with anti-Russian point of views, right?
Yeah.
The interesting part is, I give the microphone in a second to you. The interesting part is they can freeze your assets, they can restrict your travel, they basically erase your online life and without a court. So completely circumventing court. Or am I making this too black and white?
Sorry, are you making?
Or am I making this too black and white?
Well, I think it's a fair description. I think what the thing is when you talk about people with sanctions, I think there's some people who like sanctions and there's some people who dislike them. So people who like them might say that that was too black and white. I'm quite critical of sanctions, so I would say it's a fair assessment. I don't know if they completely erase your online life. What they do is they make it very difficult for you to access your, finances. I think what's interesting, if we take the example of a well-known example at this stage is Jacques Beau has been sanctioned by the EU, notably because of his online appearances, and yet he continues to be very present. So, despite the sanctions, this hasn't prevented him from engaging in the activities that the EU has decided should be banned. And maybe to just pick up on what you said in the beginning, I initially the idea was to target Russia, but they have a very broad scope in what Russia is supposedly responsible for or how these individuals contribute to Russian activities. And what I found so concerning or alarming is it's the mere fact that you might express an opinion that might be favorable towards Russia and critical of the EU or the EU's member states can cause you to be on that sanctions list. What I, if I like, I what I found alarming is when I noticed that Russian academics were being sanctioned, and the Council of the EU gave a statement of reasons, basically summarizing these individuals' publications. And in some cases, the reasons include the critical work of these scholars on sanctions. So then I thought, well, if I'm critical of sanctions, for example, would the EU then decide that I'm somehow acting in Russia's interests and therefore I should be sanctioned? So yeah, I think it could have far-reaching consequences if we're not careful.
Yes, and you said originally it was designed, against Russia. But one of the earliest people on the sanction list is, I believe, her name is Yasmin Yap. She's from South Africa, and she campaigns for also for African independence.
Right.
So it was actually has nothing to do with Russia whatsoever.
Yeah.
I think she was put on this list already 2024 or something.
Yeah. You mean Natalie Young, the other Swiss?
Natalie Young,
Yeah.
sorry. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
indeed.
Yes.
So that's what is so crazy is she campaigns for, let's say, against European neo-colonial practices. Has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine, but she's been added to that list. And so I find that case also really shocking because it suggests, or it seems to be, the council using its sanctioning power essentially to silence dissent, but it's something that really has nothing to do with the European Union. It seems more like it's an issue that, for example, France might have, and then perhaps, this is just a speculation on my part, that perhaps France found her quite irritating and decided to place her on the list. Um, yeah, so I think you can see how it can be used abusively, perhaps by some member states, and maybe other members of the Council of the EU aren't really paying too close attention, and then this happens.
Hmm. If I'm not mistaken, if I saw this right, then up until now there are 58 people on this sanction list. And when I said erase your public life, in the example from Jacques Beau, for example, yes, he can appear, but on other people's channel. He can no longer purchase something on, who told me that? He can no longer purchase something on Amazon. I'm in contact with someone else on this list.
Yeah,
His email account was blocked. Yeah, all these kind of things. So
yeah,
any company that provides any kind of financial
yeah,
assistance or even potential financial assistance is being
yeah,
criminalized.
that's true. Yeah, yeah. So it's basically anything that has to do, like you said, with your finances, it's just frozen. And like you said, there's no review mechanism. So that's also what's so shocking is you can have, it's these sanctions have been described as a civil death penalty, um, and for good reason. And this occurs without there being any form of judicial process to assess whether or not what the person is said to have done is true. And then you might even ask, if it is true, does the imposition of such restrictions, is that a correct response to what they may have done? So I think there's a lot of issues here that, yeah, are unfortunately not sufficiently or cannot sufficiently be addressed by the system that we have in place.
Hmm. And coming back to state power, if we assume that the EU is a state,
Yeah.
where do you see this going? I mean, this is the very beginning. So where do you see this going?
Well, I like to think that they tried something and they realized, okay, this is receiving some pushback or we've overstepped what we're allowed to do, and so they withdraw. So I like to think that. Of course, it's possible that they withdraw and then they do it again, and then, steadily we gradually accept the exercise of this power. I think the worst case scenario is that essentially we enter some sort of totalitarian super state where, if you express an opinion that isn't in accordance with what they think you should think or express, then yeah, you will be subject to their restrictions. I what I think there was a giveaway that this is sort of what they whoever they are, but that there was this sort of plan in place when you look at how Justin Trudeau responded to the
Yeah.
Canadian trucker protest. I mean, those were Canadian citizens expressing their freedom of expression, making use of their right to protest, their freedom of assembly, and their assets were frozen, their bank accounts were frozen, even if you weren't protesting, but if you had just provided a small financial donation to the Freedom Convoy, I think that's what it was called, your
Yeah.
bank account would be frozen. Um, and I found it, what I thought was also such a pity is that nobody taught, well, nobody, but I mean, my colleagues in international law or, fellow colleagues in law who care about human rights, nobody even knew about it, or they didn't talk about it, or they didn't think it was something that maybe signaled something worrisome down the line. And so that's why I think with the EU, I found it shocking. And you're right, it was first adopted in May 2024. And then I saw that they were listing these media outlets, so these journalists. Um, yeah, and this just seems to be this pattern or this path that we're unwittingly going down, and then some of us don't really realize it's happening, and others do. And we hope to be able to stop it before it's able to progress too much.
That's a good one. Stopping this machine has already quite some inertia,
Yeah.
and there are multiple policies that are being implemented right under our nose. So one is CSFP 2025, yeah, but there are others, like we get the digital IDs.
Yeah.
I mean, people do not realize the consequences. Maybe you want to briefly elaborate.
Yeah, well, I mean, I live in a country where they have a digital ID and they've always had a digital ID. So it's just part of your normal day-to-day life. What's also interesting is how I've noticed it's not, so I live in the EU, and in some EU states, if you want to pay with cash, it's incredibly difficult. It's kind of like stores or businesses are set up in order to only accept digital payment system. And you're also not incentivized to have cash on you because it's more and more difficult to be able to withdraw money. And I've noticed these little things that they change everywhere. And of course, you hear what some people say. The whole plan is, that we have a digital currency, we have a digital ID, and then it just becomes a lot easier to control you. And I think, at first, maybe it's easy to dismiss that as crazy conspiracy talk. But then eventually, I mean, we've seen certain instances in the past, it comes to light and it seems to be used in that way. And that's why I think the Canadian example was so revealing, because it showed just like that they could adopt something, they invoked some sort of type of security concern that honestly wasn't credible in the Canadian case, and then somehow that justifies the imposition of these restrictions on many Canadian citizens.
Hmm. Digital ID in itself
Yeah,
may have its value, but the moment you connect it to everything you do online, it becomes a total different story because every single sentence, every single word, everything, every single action, every single website you visit becomes transparent. And then you link it, my next topic, to CBDCs, also central bank
yeah,
digital currency, right? Which is not an equivalent of any kind of crypto-related decentralized system. It's the opposite. It's 100% control.
yeah,
We see it already in China where they can determine you can spend it here but not there, and you have to spend it in 3 months, otherwise it's gone. All these kind of things. They can also say you choose red, you get money. You choose green, whatever that green is, you don't get any.
yeah,
Yeah. So CSFP 2025 and these other policies become, of course, stronger by a magnitude when you link all these policies together.
yeah. I think, like you said, at first, okay, maybe digital. I think a lot of these things that exist, it's kind of part of our modern day life, and they can be innocent. And also, for us, it makes some things quite convenient. But indeed, the problem is when it's all centralized and it's all controlled, and then it becomes, your access becomes conditional. And like you said, like it's kind of like this mission creep. You know, they adopt one little thing here, and then they adopt one little thing here, and then they adopt one little thing here, and then before you know it, there's a whole system in place um, that is just easily comes together like one big machinery. And yeah, what can you do then? Now that sounds really, what's the word for it? Like almost apocalyptic or like very negative thinking. But indeed, it's possible that it happens. And that's why, and the other thing I think is because all these things are very, they seem disconnected, the way all these policy acts are adopted, that it can be hard to keep track of them and how they might be used. So, you know, you had mentioned the Digital Service Act earlier, which quite frankly, like I haven't been following closely. But of course, I think from a distance, it's like one of the ideas is to moderate the information that is being shared online. And of course, I guess the EU justifies it as a way to combat misinformation or disinformation. Maybe
That's the official
that's the
narrative.
official.
That's the official narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
But there's something, sorry, there's something underneath.
exactly.
So America has apparently sued the EU
Yeah.
Commission because of this act, because apparently, and they have subpoenaed documents from the major platform, where it appears that the EU has suppressed and censored over the last, I don't know, X years, significantly content on all those major platforms. So they're actually standing on trial right now in the US, and you hardly hear anything about it.
No, we don't. I haven't even heard of that.
Yeah,
But yeah, no, it's the thing is like they, you know, I think in the EU there's so much talk about misinformation and disinformation. And again, it's I think it's interesting how information is being securitized. So it's like there's good information and there's bad information. And how people are then supposed to be, I don't know, it's like certain things become taboo, or it's easy to dismiss someone or to stigmatize them because they might be having an opinion that has been, you know, framed in this way. And that's why I don't know, I just don't like these discussions or even using the terms of misinformation and disinformation just because it seems to be having, let's say, this kind of like mind control, progressive mind control taking place, all the while presenting it as something that's positive and, you know, meant for the greater good. But again, you know, you don't know how these tools will be implemented or used against you. Yeah.
true. Now we had JD Vance in Munich. When was it? A year ago?
I
Yeah,
think it was,
where he basically
no, I can't,
2 years ago, one year,
was it before Trump was elected or just when Trump was elected?
just when he was elected.
Yeah,
So he was blasting the EU in terms of censorship and free speech.
yeah,
At that time, I found it a bit ironic because my modest Twitter account has been permanently suspended due to authenticity violation, whilst all I do is I post shorts of my interviews. Yeah,
okay,
free speech critic coming from America.
yeah,
But looking at Trump's national security strategy
yeah.
from 2020, November 2025, I put you on the spot here. Take a wild guess. How often is the word Europe in this document? Take a wild guess. And you're not the first one that, that have asked this question.
Two, twice or zero?
49
Okay,
times.
49
The
times.
word 49 times.
Okay,
And through some, as a linguist, I notice this kind of things, through some kind of weird coincidence, there's another word 49 times in this document, and it's the word want. I want, we want, America wants, these kind of things. Yeah. So as a linguist, this tells you something.
yeah,
So this national security strategy was more about Europe than about America.
okay. Yeah, and so when and if the other word is want, in what context is want used? Like America wants Europe to do
Trump
something?
wants, America wants, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah,
So the phraseology, it doesn't really matter what stands behind it, but the phraseology tells me something, right? So it's not like we would negotiate or we would like to or we strive to or whatever. No,
yeah,
we want. It's a kind of command kind of implication. Yeah. Also the the phraseology of this document, for me also, it feels that there are parts written by completely different entities, and you can see this in the style. And I'm afraid that some parts come directly from Trump, or he had very little editing, applied, or someone had very little editing applied, and you can spot it. You
Yeah.
can spot it yourself if you read this document.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole command language seems very fitting for the Trump administration. So they seem to think that that's the right way um, to go about their international, I don't know if you call it diplomacy, but the communications and interactions that they have. Yeah, it's very much this command, what did you, language that's used. But of course, what's interesting, I think, is whether or not the counterparts accept the command. And for the EU, as far as I can tell, of course, they say certain things like, okay, Donald Trump should respect international law. Greenland belongs to Denmark. But then are they making concessions to the US all the same? So while trying to present like they're giving some pushback, but then are they in a way succumbing to the commands, let's say, of the US? I don't know. But
Trump has Trump has published private communications between various European leaders. One of which, because I live in the Netherlands, one of which spiked to me, the one where actually there was a microphone drop or something. So Rutte called him daddy. Yeah, but Trump has published multiple private communications he had with various European leaders, and they're all kind of, how shall I say this politely? There's no let's just say there's no pushback whatsoever. It's the other way around. They kind of carry him on hands.
yeah,
They do everything just to to appease him.
yeah.
This kind of things. This is something I don't understand. If you talk about state power, right? So
No, I don't understand it. And it almost sounds like within Europe, there's some sort of pathology. I don't know, like how else would you describe the fact that they don't have any backbone? Um, yeah, it's a lot of, I hear a lot of analysts and commentators trying to make sense of, what the EU does. Okay, usually the comment is the EU is basically spineless. But I also hear them try to make sense of what Donald Trump is doing or what the Trump administration is doing. And I often have the impression that they just kind of act on impulse. And I'm not even sure if Donald Trump is that aware of what is happening or what he is signing off on or what he is agreeing to. So even the one who has the idea to do something, does that even come from Trump himself? Or is he being used, put in a position where he can, sign off on something, whereas perhaps he wouldn't really have done it otherwise? Um, yeah, I don't know.
it's a very good question. It's a very good question. If you talk about those tariffs,
Yeah.
if I listen to Trump, and again, that's a question I ask myself. You can't answer it, but it's a question that I ask myself. So if Trump talks about tariff, I wonder, first of all, I wonder if Americans do know that who is paying the tariffs for goods coming from China? Now, certainly not the Chinese. The tariffs are being paid by the American public. But if I hear Trump talking about this, I have the feeling he believes that China is paying the tariffs. I have not heard a single statement which indicates that Trump actually knows that China is not, or no country is paying the tariffs if you put tariffs on them. It means when a good comes in at the border, your people have to pay the difference.
Yeah.
It's not the Chinese or whoever country you put tariffs on, right?
Yeah, I think I mean, the whole tariff discussion I find, let's say, interesting, but it kind of suggests that, okay, so people are upset in the United States of America because they feel they're on the losing side of globalization. and it's not fair because China is winning, which is slightly ironic because China essentially has played by the rules of the game that were set up by the United States of America after World War II. And the idea that we're just going to impose tariffs and that's going to solve the problem is kind of like giving the impression you're doing something when actually you're not really doing anything. Because I think what's so interesting in the tariffs is how China responded, essentially saying, well, it's your American companies who have relocated to China, who are creating their goods in China and selling them to you at a much higher price. So don't be mad at China, be mad at your American companies that have left. And so that's a bigger structural issue. But then I guess Donald Trump can pretend he's doing something by saying, I'm going to impose tariffs. But indeed, like, I don't really know to what extent that's going to solve the problem that he says he's proclaiming to solve. And it's quite possible he has no idea. I mean, I've heard economists say that he has no idea how the economy works. Um, so it's possible that he thinks tariffs work in a certain way because it would only be logical if China would pay the tariff and not the US population, right? So you can try to make that story up in your head, but that's not really how it works in real life.
Hmm. And you said it already, it's really ironic because in some countries, the Americans basically enforced the neoliberal policies at gunpoint,
Yeah,
right? So I interviewed, I don't know if you know him, John Perkins. He's the author of the book called The Economic Hitman.
yeah,
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 very, very interesting story. So what he tells is really, you go in, offer credits. Yeah, if you take it, the country is basically no longer yours, and if you don't take it, well, you may have an airplane crash.
yeah,
Also
yeah,
very black and white again,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So it's known in, yeah, let's say American history of interventionism that they've used uh, perhaps covert tactics in order to impose an economic model that serves their own interests. Another one that I find quite interesting, of course, is Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine,
Yeah,
where,
I have it here
you know,
somewhere. Yeah,
yeah. So,
yeah,
you place a country in a state of shock like you did to
yeah.
Chile once Allende was removed and Pinochet was put in place, and then you just impose an economic structure that benefits the United States of America.
And Chile is no example. I mean, we have, I don't know, more examples that I can even remember.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
So that's a structural way. So again, so America feels they've taken the shorter stick based on a policy they themselves have implemented at gunpoint. I mean,
yeah.
if you think about this,
But I think the interesting thing is that policy that they have implemented has benefited the few. And that's why it's so unsustainable, is because the vast majority of Americans have been on the losing end of the game. I mean, let's how does I think that it's quite hard. I mean, I've traveled to America, I've been there, and I find that it is such a difficult culture to live in because of this idea that you have to work really hard in order to earn a living. It's this real hustle mentality, and I think it seems that people, they're having a harder and harder time making ends meet. So it's logical that this policy that they've tried to impose or have successfully imposed on most of the world, but if most people aren't benefiting from it, they don't have any interest in upholding it. So I think eventually it'll probably reach a breaking point, and then I'd be interested to see what comes in its place if we do reach that point.
that leads me back to state
Yeah.
power. So let me think this through. So we are moving actually away from the concept of state power as the power of the state
Mhm.
and to a concept, how shall we call this, oligarchy, the
Okay.
power of large multinational corporations, some of which are already more powerful than certain states on this globe
Yeah.
today,
Yeah.
right? And of course, they have the money and the power to lobby for the laws
Yeah.
that benefit them.
Yeah.
And then which countries could come up here? So Larry Ellison, co-founder of Oracle. I don't know what if you know what they're all doing. Yeah,
Yeah.
Palantir. I mean, all these AI
Yeah.
companies, right? AI companies which are being integrated in the state as basically as surveillance platforms of their own population,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So the more desperate the state becomes,
Yeah.
the more they are inclined to utilize these kind of
Yeah.
mechanisms, which are being sold to them for billions and billions of dollars.
Yeah. What I find interesting, and one of the things, the limits of international law is it doesn't pay, it's how to put it, it focuses so much on the state as the one that has power to adopt laws and to execute them that it ignores the influence of other actors, so these corporations that you mentioned. And I think, well, we know they have a lot of power, but that power is not used in a very transparent manner at all,
Mm.
at least in the way it's presented to the public. And so they say that now, of course, if you're a corporation or a company, well, you're in the business of selling, and it's telling that what they're most interested in is data. So they need to collect all this data on individuals, and then, okay, we can assume or take a guess at what they, or maybe we don't even need to guess, at what they would need all that data for. Yeah, and then it's driven by this weird AI movement, or this surveillance movement. And I think it also suggests something about how they think, like how they perceive of human nature. So I never thought of human beings as being reducible to, data, or to, an algorithm that just needs to be cracked, or, some type of sophisticated computer system. I've always thought of human beings as, much more, let's say, how in depth would that be the word? Or, there's something, you hear this as well in other comments, that, we can be more spiritually inclined than these corporations that want to surveil us or to treat us as, an algorithm, seem willing to acknowledge. So there's this push towards that kind of power structure. But I wonder if it's not compatible with human nature. I do wonder what the outcome will be, if that makes sense. I don't know if I was abstract there, but
It makes sense, although as a behavior analyst, talking about cognitive
yeah,
biases, right? They are very, very effective,
yeah,
scarily effective.
yeah,
And with the digital fingerprints that these companies now have from us, I mean, they have psychological
yeah.
profiles you cannot imagine. And when it comes to campaigns, they can target these campaigns based on your digital profile and utilize these cognitive biases.
But that's what I find so fascinating, is the fact that it works. But I wonder, and this may just be wishful thinking on my end, that if you are aware of it, does that prevent it from
No,
having an influence on you?
no.
Or
And I can prove it.
okay,
I can prove it. Go on the website of the Harvard University, type in implicit association tests.
okay,
There are a number of tests, and you can do this multiple times. And despite the outcome,
okay,
you cannot change it. Yeah.
okay,
So the subconscious is faster than our. I found this very. They even have a disclaimer: be careful, you may not get the result that you want. Yeah.
yeah,
For example, I mean, yeah. Anyway, I did it a couple of times. I had some surprising outcomes. Yeah.
yeah,
So, but the main thing is awareness gives you very, very little protection
okay,
because you would need to be conscious.
yeah,
And if you talk about consciousness,
yeah,
people think, well, of course I'm conscious all the time. No, we can be conscious. It costs you conscious effort, but most of the time we are just, go with the flow. Yeah.
sleepwalking.
Anyway, anyone, Harvard University, implicit
Yeah,
association test can be interesting.
yeah, all right.
Okay.
I wrote it down. Yeah.
Good. Can we talk briefly about Israel? I think you wrote, what did I see? I think you wrote about something
I
in
wrote
regards to Israel.
a
So,
small thing, yeah, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, yeah.
Okay, so connection with state power. I mean, is Israel überhaupt a state? I mean, I make it again very black and white in those interviews, but legally,
Yeah.
I mean, Israel has no constitution. Israel has no borders. So is Israel a state? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I mean, let's say like as the international lawyer, I would say, well, Israel is a state because it's treated like a state. Now, I know that it's contested, but like what happens within the state or how the state decides to organize itself, whether it decides to have a constitution, whatever, however it's organized, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that there is one group that exercises effective control on that territory, and that's able to engage and to have relations with other states. So that's pretty much all that matters. I'm like really summer gross summary there. Um, and importantly, Israel is treated by a state by the vast majority of states. So of course, there's some states that say, well, we don't want to recognize Israel. But essentially, Israel is recognized diplomatically and is able to engage in diplomatic relations. So yeah, I mean, for me, Israel is a state, but the whole statehood discussion, you can see how power it really has an influence there because the Palestinians have only recently started to become recognized as a state by certain actors, and unfortunately, the nation had to undergo a genocide, which is kind of ironic. So we're going to kill a vast majority of your population, well, not majority, but a huge amount of your population, and then we're going to recognize that, oh yeah, you were a state. Um, but yeah, so yeah, I would say Israel is a state. And it's a very interesting state if you consider everything they accomplished in a very short amount of time. I think from an objective perspective, it's quite impressive. But, yeah. I don't know if you had a
Hmm.
specific question on Israel.
No, no, I was just interested from the standpoint of an international legal position, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So we then can turn this around, but you preempted my next question already. So Palestine is more and more recognized. I believe 140 of the
yeah,
193 countries in the world, meanwhile, recognize Palestine as a state.
yeah,
But then the question is, of course, what kind of Palestinian state do they recognize?
yeah,
1967,
yeah,
1948, the state which is now. So,
yeah.
but this is not defined. There's no consequence whatsoever to this recognition.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's the Palestinian tragedy. Um, yeah, I don't know how they're gonna resolve that one. I mean, of course, people say, well, the two-state solution, um, eventually, but I think again, like with international law, it's so subject to power and politics in some areas. Like some areas, it's a bit less so. But these kind of big questions when it comes to the use of force or here to statehood, it can be so arbitrary. And yeah, like you said, Palestine is recognized by the majority of states internationally. So I think you could say Palestine is de facto a state. One issue that Palestine has is, well, it cannot become a member to the United Nations. Is that even needed? Not really. It would just kind of give more credibility um, to its role as a state. But then again, what you raised is, okay, which Palestine do they recognize? And I think it's also the issue, the kind of divide and conquer policy, right? So we have the Palestinian Authority, which we consider, well, some actors consider should be the legitimate government, but then Hamas does exist, and Hamas may be labeled as a terrorist organization, so therefore not a legitimate organization. But then, of course, one of the reasons Hamas came into existence is to fight the continued occupation of Israel. And it's acknowledged that, if you are a population under occupation, you're allowed to resist that occupation. Of course, within certain limits, right? The idea is that there's international humanitarian law, so that determines how you conduct your resistance. But yeah, so I think it's just such a messy situation, and international law doesn't have an immediate solution to that problem.
We can make it even more I don't like the word complicated because in the essence, I believe things are not that complicated. But if you compare it with Ukraine, for
Yeah,
example, yeah, so the whole world was upside down. Yeah, Russia is invading Ukraine. I have screenshots from Ursula von der Leyen. The bombing of hospitals is
yeah,
war crime. Blah blah blah. Yeah. Now we turn this around.
I know.
The world looks a live stream 2 year genocide going on with approximately 200. It could even be 300,000. Yeah, approximately 200,000 dead, mostly civilians, right?
And it's underestimated
Nothing there.
because it's hard to know exactly how many have died. And yeah, I mean, I remember at first when Israel bombed a hospital, everyone was shocked, and then they went through this whole investigation process, or at least, analyzing aerial footage and so on and so forth. And then the attack on hospitals just kind of became a routine thing. Um,
Hospitals, schools, whatever. Yeah.
and then, but I think it was quite crazy. I don't know if that's the right word, but because there was this huge momentum among international lawyers, because the international law is often criticized, of course, for not having an enforcement mechanism, or it's only a mechanism that's applied against powerful states by the weaker ones. So when Russia attacked Ukraine 4 years ago, and then the EU and the US immediately acted in order to adopt unprecedented sanctions against Russia, it gave the impression that, oh, yes, actually, we can enforce international law against bigger states, powerful states. Um, and then Israel came along. And then everything that was said about Russia was not applied in the same way to what Israel has done to the Palestinian people. And that really lays bare a lot of the hypocrisy and double standards when it comes to the enforcement of international law. And a lot of people, well, I mean, when I say people, I mean like people who comment on international law or often blame Donald Trump for, the system as we know it, the so-called rules-based order. I don't really like that term, but failing. So Donald Trump is the one that's undermining it. But in my view, it's essentially how, well, what I have found most shocking is how European states have been so openly hypocritical in how they respond to different cases. Um, so you made the comparison Israel and Russia. What I found really shocking was when Israel bombed Iran, and essentially, if we're going to use the language that European and American officials had used, they said Russia committed an unprovoked aggression, right? Ukraine had not attacked Russia, at least at that stage. And then when Israel attacked Iran, well, that was, for all extents and purposes, an unprovoked use of force. Iran had not attacked Israel. And then all these European leaders were saying Israel has the right to defend itself. Instead of saying that Israel had unlawfully or unjustifiably attacked Iran, they just basically said, well, Israel has the right to protect itself. But in the case of Israel bombing Iran or Russia attacking Ukraine, both countries perceive a security threat that hasn't materialized yet in the form of an attack, but they're striking preemptively. So that discrepancy for me causes a lot more harm to, international law or the rules that regulate the use of force than the behavior, the erratic behavior of Donald Trump on the international stage.
A week ago, so I published an article. I analyzed 450 headlines, most of them from January 27 to 29, because a couple of things happened there in the headlines related to the attack on Iran.
Yeah,
The framing was interesting because whenever they talked about Iran, it was like threat and war and finger on the trigger, this kind of framing. And when the headlines talk about the US, for example, it's like considerate, negotiating, weighing options,
yeah,
these kind of
yeah.
things. Yeah.
I think that was last
And
January, right? That
yeah,
you
yeah,
did that analysis.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
I saw that.
I have. Yes, yes, yes. And I don't know if you saw. So at the moment, I'm collecting every day 200, 300, 400 headlines via RSS feeds, but also via APIs. And every month I publish a report on the framing going to the elections in October in Israel. So
Okay.
for me, it's an experiment. I'm very interested to see how the framing shifts
Yeah.
the closer we get
Yeah.
into the election cycle. Yeah.
Yeah.
I also mentioned it the last time. I have a user guide, a eight-page PDF user guide, how to analyze websites. Any viewer who is interested, reach out to me. I'm sending it around.
Yeah. Yeah. You did mention that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, there's, I was just going to say
Alexander,
it's kind of interesting the discrepancy between how a newspaper can frame and approach something, the language they use, and the ones that I would be inclined to use as an international lawyer. You know, like the language just used for the United States actions isn't necessarily the one that I would want to use myself, but okay.
I do not consider most news outlets, let's just be more specific, mainstream news outlets, as neutral
No, of
platforms.
course not. No.
If you look at the background, who's funding them, etc., etc., I mean, it's obvious. So
Yeah.
they are projecting their objectives. And since we know, and I know that you know, but between 60 and 85% of the people only read headlines.
Yeah.
So editors know this, of course. They spend a lot of time and effort crafting and
Yeah.
framing the headlines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Sometimes you'll see a headline or a very, just like the first few sentences of the article, they present it in a certain way, and then you read it, and it has nothing to do, you know, the facts that they explain afterwards has nothing to do with the first impression that they give. But yeah, like you said, it's because we have a short attention span. We just go through things very quickly and move on to the next. Yeah.
And it's getting shorter and shorter.
Yeah.
Alexandra, we have discussed quite some topics, but is there anything that's close to your heart that we have not scratched on?
I don't know.
What are you doing today? I mean, what are you researching today? What's your main
Um,
field of interest?
well, my main, so I wanted, to be honest, I wanted to move away from sanctions because I feel like I've been doing it for too long. But then there's all these new developments that are happening that you know still keep me interested in. But what I'm interested in at the moment is actually what I call international lawyers experiencing a crisis of faith. So I'm kind of interested in international law as a belief system and what the function that that belief system fulfills at a social psychological level. And I think that with everything, all the events that have been happening over the past few years, I just, because I hear a lot of my colleagues say I don't believe in international law anymore. But to say I don't believe in something, I thought that was curious language. So yeah, I started to kind of analyze or discuss international law as a belief system. And if we have that belief system that starts to crumble, well, what kind of, let's say, emotions does that evoke in us? How do we cope? So that's kind of what I'm interested in. Yeah.
It's very interesting, actually. So I interviewed Ambassador Chas Freeman. He's quite, US Ambassador Chas Freeman.
Yeah.
He's quite outspoken. He told me in one of the interviews, diplomacy is dead. And I think so is international law. But I have a question for you. If someone is considering not to study international law, but international
Yeah.
relations, would you advise that to do, or do you say,
Well, so I studied international relations and then I studied international law.
okay,
And I
okay,
think international relations, I mean, states will always have interactions with each other. And maybe the way that we study international relations or, you know, the institutions that exist now, they might change radically, but still there will always be something to study. And even though I feel quite skeptical about international law, I still think it's an interesting study object. Even like law in and of itself, I think is quite an interesting, let's say, social construction. Not to use fancy
hmm,
language, but just the existence of law and why we need it, why we want it, why some of us are so committed to it, why others aren't. You know, it's kind of this interaction we can have with power and authority. I find that quite interesting. So I think depending on what your expectations are from international law or from international relations, yeah, I think both can be interesting study objects.
Yeah, it's actually an abstract concept. As a law in itself doesn't matter which one.
Yeah.
It's an abstract object because basically it's a human invention, a
Yeah.
cultural is cultural. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I find it really interesting just to study, what are the laws that took place throughout history. It seems that when, I don't know if it's true, but you almost have the impression that when human beings start to organize themselves and start to live collectively, they kind of place these rules. These rules are in place in order to regulate or to manage their relations, their interactions. Um, yeah, and these laws always say something interesting, I think, on what the role of the human being is or should be in society. So I think it just kind of reveals these interesting things that we might not necessarily be aware of. Yeah.
I just remembered, and don't nail me on the cross, but I believe it was Plato who said, and I'm paraphrasing, you can measure the level of decadence of a society on the number of laws.
Mhm.
Meaning, the more laws a society has, the more this society is in decline,
Yeah,
right? And we see this now. I mean, especially in the Netherlands, you have laws for everything,
I know. I
for
think
everything.
it's crazy. And I think as sometimes I have the impression, even if it's not a law, but if you're dealing with bureaucracy, sometimes I just feel it's people who were bored and who thought I have to create a function or I have to fill in some void, and in order to regulate it, and then I don't know, somehow having more rules sometimes provides a feeling of security. But yeah, they can. The more rules you have, it can really end up being very counterproductive, let's say, or even
Mm.
handicapping for human development.
Yeah, I have a last one just popping in my mind. If you come back to state power and fiat currency, and you look at the current situation. So I checked this morning, American debt is 38.7 trillion US dollars.
Okay,
So how does that translate to the power of the state of America?
yeah. But I think what interesting thing is with American power, and they talk about it a lot, is whether or not the dollar is in decline or it's sustainable. And one of the issues, of course, they can have such a huge debt because they enjoy being the most dominant currency. But once that stops, a lot of the power they had, I mean, they will be flooded with their own money. They're going to have possibly a huge economic issues. And interestingly, yeah, I mean, who did America sell its debt to? And if its dollar is no longer supporting that debt, I mean, it's kind of interesting how states can create their own, what would I call it, their own security issues or participate in their own downfall kind of by adopting certain policies that down the line harm them. What I find very interesting is when you talk about de-dollarization is in the mainstream commentaries or even by American officials, it's like, oh no, we don't want to do fear mongering. It's almost as if, oh, what a silly thing to think that, the dollar is in decline. But you hear more and more people talk about it. And I think, didn't China make an announcement lately that it won't be using the dollar anymore and only the yuan? So,
Yeah, so multiple countries,
yeah,
multiple countries. Incidentally, both Saddam Hussein and Libyan's Gaddafi, what did they have in common?
yeah, exactly.
They started to they started to sell oil against something
Yeah,
else than the US dollars,
yeah.
right?
And I think Gaddafi
So
even wanted to create, to set,
the gold standard.
yeah, because they're pegged to some countries in Africa don't have even their own currency, let's say. They
Yeah,
wanted to switch that, and then that's when you have regime change take place. Yeah.
yeah. Alexandra, it was really interesting talking to you.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for spending this little hour on what is today, Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah. Um,
And you will hear from me again.
okay, perfect. Well, thank you for your time. I don't know if you're still recording, but sorry for my, well, thanks for your flexibility again with the schedule.
All good. All good.
Okay, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.